Picture this. It's the early 90s. The Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis are everywhere. You have one. Your neighbor has one. Your cousin has one. They're in every department store between here and your local mall. Gaming has become mainstream. It's affordable. It's accessible. It's everywhere. And then someone puts out a competing console that's selling for upwards of $700. And the games? $200 each. Not $200 for a bundle, $200 per game. The Neo Geo, the 3DO, systems that looked like they came from a different planet and were priced like they'd just been imported from one. We often look back at these consoles as expensive mistakes, overconfident companies pricing themselves right out of relevance. But is that really what happened? Or were these companies simply building gaming around a completely different idea of what the future would look like? To understand the logic, you have to understand what everyone else was doing at the time. By the early 90s, Nintendo and Sega had already cracked the code on mass market gaming. The NES had sold nearly 62 million units worldwide. The Super Nintendo was building toward 49 million, and the Sega Genesis was right there with it. These weren't niche products, they were household names. Prices were reasonable, libraries were growing, third-party developers were lining up. The whole economy of gaming just made sense. Get the hardware out cheap, sell millions of consoles, then sell millions of games, build the foundation. That was the playbook, and it was working. So when you saw a $700 console sitting next to a $150 one, the obvious reaction was someone just made a huge mistake. But that assumes everyone was playing the same game. However, not everyone believed gaming should evolve that way. Meet the Neo Geo Advanced Entertainment System, or AES. SNK, the Japanese arcade company behind it, wasn't trying to compete with Nintendo on Nintendo's terms. They weren't building a home console. They were building a home arcade. The Neo Geo Multi-Video System, or NVS, which was SNK's arcade cabinet format, ran the exact same software at the exact same power level as the AES. No downgrades. No compromises, no home version. What you played at the arcade was basically what you played in your living room, and that had never really existed before. The AES was described as hardware for gaming connoisseurs who refused to accept compromised home ports of arcade classics. The cartridges were enormous. The visuals were genuinely stunning for the time. The hardware was arcade grade, and the price reflected all of that. Early AES cartridges came in around $120 to $170, rising to about $200 at retail by the summer of 1991. And yes, that is a single game. That's not a typo. But here's the thing. People still bought them. No, it wasn't millions of people, but the right people. Arcade enthusiasts, collectors, people who wanted the real thing and had the disposable income to prove it. SNK believed gamers would pay premium prices for uncompromised technology. That wasn't a business mistake. That was an ideology. And for a narrow, dedicated audience, it worked exactly as intended. The Neo Geo was seductive in a very specific way. It was the system you'd see on display at a game store in the mall and immediately think, who owns this? It had the aura of something rare and premium, and that was the whole idea behind the product. But why were those games so expensive? If you've ever looked at a Neo Geo cartridge next to, say, a Super Nintendo cartridge, you've seen how massive they are in comparison. But they're still just video game cartridges, right? So what's the deal? Well, the answer is that cartridge cost was affected by a number of different factors. not the least of which was the ROM size, or the chips that stored the actual game data. The largest Super Nintendo games landed around 32 megabit. The largest Neo Geo games were closer to 700. Neo Geo carts also used specialized boards and contacts completely different from anything Nintendo or Sega was producing. And here's the part that is often overlooked. These weren't manufactured at the scale of millions. They were manufactured at the scale of thousands. Nintendo sold cartridges like consumer products. SNK sold them like specialized hardware. When you're not spreading production costs across massive volume, every unit carries more of the burden. It's basic math, and it's also brutal. Now let's talk about the 3DO for a second, because it had a different architecture, but the same underlying problem. Trip Hawkins, the founder of Electronic Arts and the man who left that company to personally oversee 3DO, was one of the sharpest minds in gaming. He genuinely believed the Nintendo model was broken. In 2011, looking back, he put it plainly, saying, "Nintendo came along and software licensing came in, and we've been in a dark age since then." That tells you everything about the bet he was making with 3DO. His solution was an open licensing model. Rather than manufacturing hardware themselves, 3DO licensed the technology to outside companies like Panasonic and Goldstar, who made the actual consoles. Publishers got in for just $3 per game in royalties, far cheaper than Nintendo or Sega charged. The logic was elegant on paper. Hawkins himself explained it in a 1994 developer interview, talking about why they went all in on CD-ROM. He said, "Cartridges are way too expensive, and they can't have a lot of memory. With those two limitations, it would be very difficult to expand the market demographic for multimedia software." Now, he wasn't wrong about cartridges, but the solution created a different problem. Because hardware manufacturers couldn't subsidize the console cost the way traditional console makers could. They had to make money on the box itself. No long game. Panasonic needed a profit on day one. 3DO launched in October of 1993 at $699. For reference, that same amount would buy you a Super Nintendo, a Sega Genesis, and a handful of games for each. Both Neo Geo and 3DO were trapped by business models that depended on high prices. Now, this wasn't greed, and it wasn't ignorance. The prices were inevitable, given how the machines were built and sold. If premium gaming was to succeed, the only way forward was to change the model entirely. E3, 1995. Sega takes the stage and announces the Saturn, available now, $399. Then Sony walks out. The PlayStation, $299. That $100 gap, announced in a room full of press and developers, didn't just shift the conversation, it rewrote it. Sony kept the appeal of high-end gaming while removing the economics that made systems like Neo Geo and 3DO unsustainable. The secret weapon was the format. CD manufacturing costs were a fraction of cartridge production. Risk per title dropped dramatically. Publishers could afford to experiment. Libraries could grow faster. But here's the part that often gets underrated. PlayStation still felt cutting edge. It had the futuristic branding, the mature aesthetic, the 3D visuals that made gamers feel like they were stepping into the future. Sony understood that gamers didn't just want affordable hardware. They wanted to feel like they were getting something advanced. By May of 2004, less than a decade after launch, PlayStation had shipped 100 million units worldwide, the first home console to ever hit that number. By the same point, it had over 7,300 titles and nearly 1 billion in software shipments. Sony merged the two things that seemed in conflict, the feeling of high-end and the reality of affordable. That's the breakthrough, not just the price, the psychology. After the success of the PlayStation, the industry didn't just follow Sony's pricing, it followed Sony's logic. Hardware subsidies became the norm. Console makers accepted short-term losses on hardware to build the foundation that would generate long-term software revenue. Install base became the primary metric that mattered. Arcade culture, which had driven the high-end philosophy of companies like SNK, started its long decline. Why go to the arcades when the living room experience was catching up and eventually surpassing it? The industry learned that scale mattered more than uncompromised power. Trip Hawkins, to his credit, eventually acknowledged what went wrong. After 3DO folded, he traced the failure back to his own licensing model, concluding that without a single company controlling market, hardware, and software in a coordinated way, the whole thing just fell apart. The open ecosystem he'd bet his career on turned out to need exactly the kind of strong central hand he'd spent years arguing against. Power without the ability to scale it becomes a dead end. The expensive systems of the 90s weren't just priced out of the mainstream, they were priced out of a future that was being built around entirely different rules. So here's the thing about the Neo Geo, the 3DO, and other high-end systems of the early 90s. They weren't wrong about everything. The Neo Geo was genuinely impressive. The 3DO was genuinely ahead of its time in some ways. The people who bought them knew exactly what they were getting, but they were wrong about something more fundamental. SNK's zero-compromise philosophy assumed that the ceiling of the experience was what gamers cared about most, that if the hardware was pure enough, the price would follow. Trip Hawkins believed gaming would merge with premium consumer electronics, that being the most advanced multimedia platform was its own argument, that the industry was in a dark age of licensing control, and the 3DO was the way out of it. Sony, however, believed something different. Gamers wanted cutting-edge experiences, but without cutting-edge prices. Not a cheaper, compromised version of the premium thing, not good enough. The actual thing, just finally within reach. The expensive consoles of the 90s weren't just overpriced products. They were failed predictions about who gaming was for. The companies that lost believed gaming's future would belong to the most advanced hardware. The company that won figured out how to make advanced hardware feel attainable for everyone. So I'm interested to know, if you were around back then, what was the first console that felt completely out of reach for you? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy gaming, my friends.